Hey guys, before we start the show, I just want to give a quick shout out to another podcast.
Hey there, my name is Andy, host of the History of Africa podcast. If you like learning about the history of the Asia Pacific, I bet you'd also like learning about the history of the African continent. Our current season is focused on ancient Egypt. If that sounds appealing to you, come check out the History of Africa podcast here on YouTube, Spotify, iTunes, and on our website, historyofafricapodcast.blogspot.com. Back to you, Craig.
Well, hello there. Welcome to the Pacific War Channel, the channel where we cover the history of the Asia-Pacific War of 1937 to 1945, and all the major events that led up to it.
必须要团结一致，消灭日本。不可以，你怎么？
And unfortunately, we are using Zoom today because the COVID measures in the province we live in Canada have become very strict.
Yeah, not like you guys were paying to see my face anyways, so glad to be here, but you're going to deal with my voice for today.
So for audio listeners who, I'm actually above 1,000 downloads on Podbean. I don't know if that's good or not, but there are audio listeners. Sorry if the quality is less than usual. For those who watch on YouTube, I'm going to put up some random paintings and pictures to entertain you as we do this for once. So there is a bonus. And you get to look at my parrot in the background. She is as notorious as ever, waving around. And this episode is going to be a discussion about an episode I made not too long ago on the Meiji Restoration. Meiji, not Meiji, which I'm going to get a lot of flack for a few weeks, I'm sure. Already seen some comments.
Yeah, well, we all know you're famous for your pronunciation, so
yeah,
that
actually,
ought to go really well. But
little
I
update.
wouldn't do any better, so.
Little update, a certain individual has contacted me to talk about my pronunciation of Chinese names, places, and events, and he is actually going to be doing a podcast with me soon to help me with my pronunciation in Cantonese or Mandarin. I'm actually not sure which one this will be under. Simplified Chinese at this point. So we'll see where that goes. This will be an interesting podcast where I get slapped around.
Yeah. So, let's talk about the Meiji Restoration.
You know what? I think the best way to describe it is the same way I described at the beginning of the episode in question. Making an episode on the Meiji Restoration is like trying to explain the entire Renaissance.
Yeah, it's a lot going on, a lot of changes, both culturally, economically, socially. And it went over a fair period of time too. It wasn't a 15-year rebellion or anything like that. You're talking a good anywhere between 60 and 100 years, depending on how you want to talk about it.
Technically, till we're looking at like 1858 to I should have technically gone to 1912, but
yeah.
Purposes of, because I'm making a YouTube channel and my next huge episode is going to be the first Sino-Japanese War. I didn't want to talk about it, so I cut it at about 1890.
Yeah, well, that's it, and it's officially till 1912, but I mean, some people even argue that it sort of leaks all the way into the First World War and whatnot. But for sure, a lot of changes. I mean, looking at Japan, their export business completely shifted from one side to the other. They went from being a lesser known country to one of the world powers. A whole lot happened. So, well, why don't you take me through a little bit what happened with the structure of Japan itself, and then we'll get into the financial stuff later, which I know some people like.
Yeah, so like most episodes, I'll try to brutally summarize it. So the episode even before I did the Meiji Restoration was the opening of Japan, because Japan had gone through 214 years of very hardcore isolation, the Sakoku period. This didn't mean that they didn't have some small trade. They did trade with like the Dutch, for instance, but it was very, very limited. And of course, they trade with China. Needless to say, when good old, Uncle America came to burst open the door, Japan was quite unprepared. There's a lot of debate at the time. Some people wanted to fight the Western barbarians, as they called them. Some people just wanted to sign the treaties that were being, put before them. They said, okay, we don't have any chances of survival. We just need to go along with this and try to work our way up. So that became a very short period called the Bakumatsu period. It's a lot of Westerners are coming in the country. They're completely disrupting Japanese society because they're trying to trade, and they're trading all over the place. So Japan wasn't centralized very well, and a lot of regions were just basically independently doing things with these Western nations. For instance, Satsuma clan literally attacked the British. The British beat the hell out of them. The Satsuma were so shocked at how powerful the British weapons were that they asked them to trade with them, and they specifically bought a lot of weapons. Then we had two factions come about. There was a pro-shogunate faction, because the shogun was the ruler of Edo Japan, which was the Tokugawa family at this period, and there was an anti-shogunate faction. So basically the anti-shogunate faction wanted to dissolve the shogun, because obviously he was the big head cheese of everything. So to get rid of the shogun, they said, let's put the emperor back in charge like the old days, and let's expel the barbarians. Originally, this is what they said. The shogunate faction said, we need to sign these treaties, we need to work with the Westerners because it's in our best interest for survival. Interestingly, the shogunate faction would fight a civil war called the Boshin War. They lost. The anti-shogunate faction, which was mostly Satsuma, Choshu Tosa domain, got the emperor at the time to come on board with them. They became an imperial force, and they just destroyed Tokugawa Yoshinobu. Needless to say, their original idea of expelling the barbarians was completely tossed out after the war. It was ridiculous. They couldn't possibly do it. They had no means to. So what happened was they ushered in the Meiji Era. I said Meiji, oh my god. The Meiji Era with Emperor Meiji at the throne. And the point of the episode was to just show all the shifts they had to do, because they were looking at the world and they saw that they were extremely unprepared they had no modern military. They had no modern institutions. Everything was inadequate, basically, from their point of view. And the only way to survive what they saw as a threat of war from Western nations, or to be colonized, because we're looking at China at the same time, and China's going through 2 opium wars. And from the most part, it looks like China has just been completely, utterly destroyed as being colonized. Japanese are terrified. So they say, we need to become exactly what these people are that are colonizing everyone. They send out a mission, the Iwakara mission, to go look at all the countries in the world, the most powerful, and they want to copy their educational institutions, political, military, etc. Take the best from every single place that has the best. And they do it. And the Meiji Restoration is basically, it's a complete shift of what was Tokugawa Edo Japan into a new era, which fused Western ideals with ancient Japanese ideals, because the population they didn't think would be completely on board if they didn't, take something from their ancient beliefs. And this was actually seen as a way of getting rid of Chinese ideals, because obviously Japan had like 90% of its influence was from China for a lot of its history, and they wanted to kind of diminish that and go back to the ancient way of the Yamato race, as you would have called it.
Yeah, well, you mentioned in your previous episodes that it was always a very big brother, little brother kind of relationship with China and Japan. But you could very easily argue that this is when Japan started, not necessarily to overtake China, but this is when they really started growing out of the shadow. And part of it, like you said, being China in complete ruin, as far as so many civil wars going on, the downgrade of their economy because of everything going on after having lost all the wars, after being colonized, after losing so many major cities and trading ports. This is where Japan really started to shine. And I mean, you could tell that by their rapid population growth, their economic growth. Like you said, they went to modernize a lot of things, going more for Western and European standards and ideals on that. But it really rose them it's almost like they got more than what they expected, rather than just doing it to not be colonized or not be invaded. They actually rose to being one of the strongest powers in the world at that time. And right up until the world wars began, they were. And it took them a long time to come back from that, but this is really what put them on the map.
Yeah, if you were grading them on a score of 1 to 10 on all the nations that industrialized themselves, Japan, it's a 12. It's in a league of its own. It did what other Western nations did in 200, 100 years. They did it in 25 to 40. It's incredible.
Yeah, well, if you look, I was looking over some stuff myself, and if you look around the mid 1850s, right at the beginning, I mean, Japan's population growth was massive, getting to a point where you look, Edo had a population of almost 1 million people, Kyoto and Osaka around 400,000 each, which is starting to be really, really big considering the size of their country itself. And at the time, one of their main commodities, or their main commodity, was actually rice. And what was nice and how that made their economy go around, not only obviously is it a consumable commodity, which helps a lot when you have rapid population growth, because like we saw in China, food is a very, very large concern when you have such fast population growth. So rice was a good answer to that, and that's why most of the local farmers actually paid their taxes in the form of rice at the time. The daimyos would take anywhere, I think you reported 40 to 60% of their crop growth every year was paid to tax, which was a fair chunk, and some farmers suffered for it.
Enormously,
but at the same time, they're living off the land. And it got to a point that daimyos, I think, got a little bit greedy with this, because they were even making, I'm trying to remember what they called them exactly, but in essence, they were selling contracts for rice that had not yet been harvested to try and raise more money for the capitals in the state. And for those of you who follow modern finances, this is actually, you could argue it's one of the first times where you'd see something similar to a futures contract or a futures trade.
Yeah.
Where they were basically buying and selling rice that hadn't grown or hadn't been harvested yet. Which is a really interesting concept when you look at modern economics.
Just to explain to the audience, because this actually is something they should conceive, in Edo, Japan, rice is actually a currency in a lot of ways, because the daimyos would be paid in koku, which is a one-person serving of rice for a year. So technically, the daimyos were paid in coinage, mind you, too, but a lot of the daimyos were being paid in koku, which they paid to their samurais. So there would be a tier list of high-ranking to low-ranking samurais within their Han domains, and then they would allocate the funds, depending on the rank of the family. There's a very strict caste system. So rice is it was unbelievably important to the economy. And got pretty messed up during the Meiji era.
But that's when they shifted so much to textiles, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But bring us through the mid 1800s to kind of your ending point there, and we'll get into some textiles.
It's so hard to try and summarize this in a chronological order, but I had originally said that there was a civil war. The civil war, as you would imagine, thinking of Edo Japan, was fought among samurai. Like the Shinsengumi, legendary mercenary force under the Tokugawa Shogunate, fighting against Satsuma's samurai force, led by Saigo Takamori, the last samurai, actually, most famous probably in the world. So when they won the Boshin War, there was a charter oath that was raised to Emperor Meiji, and he, of course, acknowledged the charter oath. And a part of this meant that they needed to modernize the army. And a modern army, as you would see in any Western force, would be conscription. It's commoners picking up guns, right? This is unheard of in Japanese society. You trained as a samurai, and the peasants were, actually treated terribly, and you could kill them if they disrespected you, but you were the guys who had the weapons. They abolished what was the caste system, which was called Shono Kosho. And I actually have everything written here. Shinokosho, already mispronounced it. Shinokosho was a caste system. Shi was the warrior caste. No was the farming peasants class. Ko, craftsmen and artisans. And Sho was the merchant class. And funny thing, merchant class was the lowest in the official class system. There was actually untouchables like you would see in India, and these were leather tanners and such. So when they abandoned this caste system, that meant that everybody was a commoner. You know, you could look towards your own future, do any type of work you want. You weren't in the rigid feudal system where, you know, it was your dad was a samurai, you were a samurai. But this also meant the end of the samurai, and it was the end of daimyos. Daimyos became governors, hands became prefectures, and the farmers ended up in a peculiar situation. They now owed taxes to the government, and the taxes were half their crops, and the other half was basically going to the governors. And a lot of these farmers were tenants, so they didn't own their property. So these farmers couldn't really survive. It was awful. It's a terrible growth spurt for a while, and it didn't get fixed for quite. It took a long time to fix the farming situation. I'll say that much.
Yeah, well, I think that's what led to a lot of the production shift in Japan. Now, when you're talking about this change in general rankings, where the daimyos became governors and all this stuff, did they still more or less keep the pecking order the same, or did some people kind of get flip-flopped around as far as their general importance in the society?
So all the former daimyos, almost all of them just became governors of the prefecture, which was already their hand. So in Edo, Japan, all of the different provinces were called hands, but now there was a newly established prefecture. It didn't really change much of the border lines or anything, but it was just a way for them to kind of legitimize this new central government. So the daimyos, this is where it gets interesting. Remember, they just fought a civil war, and the southern clans of Satsuma, Choshu, and Tosho were the winners. The northern clans had allied themselves to the shogunate and lost. You would think they would penalize and hurt all these people who lost the war. They didn't.
Really?
The emperor and a lot of them, even the victors, said, you know, this is a terrible war, but there was a goodwill, and they let everyone have positions. A lot of the people who lost the war ended up in high-ranking positions, surprisingly. And everyone got a piece of the pie if you were already a big cheese. I mean, I'm sure some people lost out, but for the better part, they kind of describe it as they just moved on to government positions. A lot of the talk is if you were a samurai, you would probably become a high-ranking officer in the military, or, you know, you would do certain things. Become a businessman, some of them.
Really? That's definitely a switch, though, because back then I think you were describing that you were more born into a samurai's lifestyle.
Yeah, absolutely.
So basically, you were born and bred to only do that, and to have to switch to a different kind of occupation must have been a bit tough for them.
And this is where we're going to get to the second war that occurred. The abolishment of the samurai class had devastating effects on society, as you would imagine. A lot of samurai could not cut it out in this new world. A lot of samurai ended up joining the military. They joined institutions like politics, education, being a merchant, even though that was seen as really disgraceful in Edo times. But of course, we had a lot of samurai who simply couldn't do anything. They became unemployed and disaffected, disenfranchised. It was terrible. And someone took notice of this, and his name was Saigo Takamori, the great victor who led Satsuma clan, the largest clan arguably during the Boshin War. Do I have a picture? I don't even... Well, anyways, anyone can look up Saigo Takamori. If you watch The Last Samurai, Ken Watanabe's character is based off him loosely. It's not very accurate, that film. So Saigo Takamori, he didn't really appreciate a lot of the changes that were going on, but he understood them and abided them. He understood modernization in the military and such, and he himself educated himself on the use of Western artillery, and he became a great military leader.
Right.
But as the years went on, more and more things kept changing, and he felt that the people in politics were corrupt and they were messing over the country. One thing in particular is a famous conversation that he had over Korea. When the emperor was established as the new ruler of Japan again, they sent an envoy to Korea, and they had written it in such a way using certain kanji symbols that basically are used just for the emperor, who the Koreans respected to be the Chinese emperor at that time because they were in that sphere of influence. It's not like it was intentional, but the Japanese, when they sent this letter, they were basically saying to Korea, okay, you're a vassal state now of us because we have an emperor. And the Koreans were like, no, we're going to stick with China, so don't talk to us like that. They actually later fixed this whole situation, but Saigo Takamori basically said, well, we've been insulted. A lot of people feel like we've been insulted in Japan. And he said, why don't you send me as an envoy? And I'm basically going to be an asshole, get myself assassinated by them, and we'll have a reason to go and invade them, because he was pushing to invade Korea. The reasons why he would want to do this, probably, as a lot of scholars would say, is because he saw so many disenfranchised samurai in his country. He's like, why don't we just take all the guys who are unemployed and stuff, bring them to Korea, and they'll just rule it like a feudal state, because they understand that system and they aren't adapting to the new one, right? Actually, kind of smart.
Other than the getting himself killed part, like an idiot.
Oh, he wanted to. He just said, he actually, it's in writing. He's like, I'm just going to act like a complete, he said, I'm not going to be a good envoy like the other person who should be sent, and they'll probably kill me. And he said, there you go. They said no. They said, we're modernizing the country. We can't possibly do an expedition to attack a country like Korea. And this basically was the last straw for Saigo Takamori. The first one was he was a great victor of this war. They threw out the Sono Joy movement, which was expelling the barbarians. That was the first notch that hurt him. They messed over the samurai class. That really bothered him. So after he was told no to the expedition to Korea, he retired. He resigned from his government position, which was a great one. He was known as one of the three great nobles of Japan, and he went back to his Han of Satsuma, where he formed an academy for military training, very modern, and he took in ex-samurai, as you would imagine, those who couldn't find work. This turned into almost, I think, 132 academies. And I don't know if it was his purpose to do this, but he basically created a paramilitary force that could overthrow the government by accident. Because all these students were being trained in modern artillery and, guns. Like, this is not Last Samurai as it would portray it with samurai swords. Like, of course, they had swords on them, but this was modern arms. And the government went ahead and sent spies to see what he was doing. They got caught, and one of the spies said he was sent there to kill Saigo Takamori. So the students all raided every single arsenal in the prefecture, taking all the weapons. The government freaked out, attacked them, and the students asked Saigo, we should rebel, and he reluctantly did. And he rebelled against the government, wearing his military uniform to show his allegiance to the emperor, mind you, and he simply said, I'm going to march to Tokyo to ask questions of corrupt politicians. That was his official kind of statement. Yep. And that led to what would be called the last stand of the samurai, where he eventually was defeated on the Battle of Shiroyama, and he died.
Yep.
I'll have a whole episode on this, and I put a lot of work into it. It's going to be great, but I know that was like a summarization of like one of the most legendary battles in Japanese history, and it doesn't do it justice, but yeah.
Now, you mentioned military students. Let's get into students of another kind, because you said there was huge education reforms.
Oh, yes.
In the time in Japan. Going to 3 different school systems, I think you said, primary, middle, and university.
Yeah, and it changed very quickly over the years, but at the beginning, I'm not sure if I even said in the episode, it was like they only had like 4 months of education at the beginning. It's a little funny. Eventually, it becomes the exact same education model that we see today. But the first universities were mostly military, great universities, and initially in the Meiji Era, it was, the most important thing I would say was making sure everyone's literate. They really focused on that. This is before the unbelievable militarization of the country, but the literacy was incredible. They almost had like 100% literacy, I think, by World War I, and they were the only country to really do that.
Yeah, a lot of the other European countries, and especially China, was lagging behind in that. Might have something to do with China still being in the middle of an opium crisis, but we're not going to go there.
Yeah, poor China is, during the Meiji Restoration, is going to face a handful of more rebellions, a Muslim uprising, and other things. Then they're going to get attacked by Japan, and they're going to have the Boxer Rebellion, which is kind of the nail in the coffin.
Yeah, no, they're not doing too hot. Now, as far as these education systems, though, was it only the primary one that was mandatory, or did they have to go through all of them? How did...
University, I wouldn't imagine. So primary, yes. So your elementary and primary, absolutely.
Okay, because I don't think they were filling out college applications like they do in North America now, but for sure some of it had to be mandatory if that was like a full education reform.
Yeah.
Now, we were talking before a little bit about, I had mentioned the textiles, and we're kind of getting right into the end of your, what are we drinking over there?
I shouldn't do product placement, but it happens to be a Japanese beer, so I thought that was kind of funny.
Oh, excellent.
Kidding.
Did you send me one at least? Of course not.
Yeah, it has a Purell bottle attached to it.
Yeah, excellent. So we're getting into around the late 1800s, 1890s, up until about 1920, which is kind of where you tailed off with Japan. But this is when the Japanese textile industry really blew up.
I can put up a little... I do have one. Yeah, the raw silk production chart here.
Exactly. And so that's a perfect chart to show you how much it grew in the space of basically the Meiji Restoration, so 50 or 60 years. Their production went up almost 12-fold, which is absolutely ridiculous. A big part of this is not just due to the population growth, it's the fact that they were shying away from the rice production because it was crushing most of the farmers, and they were going more towards handmade production. I think you even mentioned in the episode a lot of this was done by women while they were home.
Actually, the silk business in Edo, Japan was almost, I would argue, and I know there might be someone who will say something else, it was exclusively in households run by women, whereas the Meiji Era goes from this to steam-powered factories. So you can imagine, you're looking at the numbers and you see, okay, this is industrialization. There you go.
Yeah, well, that's basically what it was. But the silk production really stayed very steady for quite a while after this extreme boom. But there was that other side of it where the men's labor, and a lot of it went more into factories and production. And the fact that they almost completely skipped water-powered and went straight to steam-powered factories, which was a huge blow-up and just shot them right to the front of the line as far as production goes. The only issue they ran into is that going from a feudal system with workers that, let's just say, were I don't want to call them slaves, but let's say they weren't well compensated for their labor.
They were serfs.
Yeah, basically. Switching from that over to wage labor, you'd think it would be a really good thing for the workers and for the country itself. The problem is, with wage labor started coming wage disputes. And they started seeing the first strikes in the mines and in the steel mills and all the places where the production was happening, and actually started leading to the forming of the first workers' unions in Japan, which anybody who's dealt with unions before knows that it's a whole basket of trouble for a lot of things.
They had a reason. They had big reasons.
No, and it's not to say that their claims aren't justified. The problem is having jumped to the front of the line, now all of a sudden they have such a huge production demand for these resources, but now that they're having union disputes, wage disputes, all this, strikes left, right, and center. They even had to shut down 2 main mines, which had to be retaken over by the military when they went on strike. It slows down production a lot, and instead of going from a little production, and now we're not doing anything. Now you have this big booming industry, and when it all of a sudden comes to a standstill, it can really, really hurt the economy. But nonetheless, they went from, you could argue, very, very old style to extremely modern in the period of 50 years, which is ridiculous.
Yeah, growing pains. So like you were mentioning, and it's funny to say, oh, there were strikes. Arguably, some of these were worse than what we see in the Western world during the industrialization period. I mean, the Japanese, they were being, 12-hour shifts and living in barracks and coal mines. And then they're being beaten by guards. The guards are not letting them slack off. Like, this was brutal. The Conscription Act that took people into the military was being called by the commoners as a blood tax. And they associated this with the farming tax that we had mentioned earlier, where the farmers are paying 50% of their, crops and taxes to the government, but then the other 50% is going to all these other things. It was absurd. So yeah, everyone got hurt.
It made it very, very hard for the labor to live to be sustainable, and I think that's what hurt them. Sort of coming into the later years and into the First World War, is what slowed them down a little bit. And we'll get into that, I think, in a future episode when you talk more about that stuff in the early 1900s. But it definitely made it difficult, and especially when they had to bring the military in to reclaim these mines that had gone on strike. I don't know. Do you have some rough numbers as to how many perished or
in the strikes?
Because when they brought the military in, it was. I seem to remember reading it was quite the massacre, but
I didn't go extremely in depth into it because I couldn't touch every subject I wanted. But there was two major strikes I almost put in the episode. One was a silk production strike made by women, which I thought was interesting because you don't often see those as being put in the limelight as much. They're usually put down pretty quick and they're not reported on. And then there was the one was the coal mining strikes that you had mentioned, which a lot of people died because they were attacked by the military and suppressed brutally. But it's always been, argued that it was on the same page as any other Western country that went through its industrialization phase, but brutal. In the Midwest of Canada, we had some really bad ones in Calgary and Saskatchewan.
Yeah, that's true. That's definitely true. I'm trying to see if I can look it up quickly.
And I'll just oh god, there's so much to cover. That's why I almost didn't do the episode. It's you're gonna get flack from everybody about things you're not mentioning. It's like there was also in the economy the Zaibatsu system, which one of the major Zaibatsus was Mitsubishi. And everyone knows like Mitsubishi's a grand story. They start off as this minor kind of shipping company. They end up doing odd things. Like I think they even make cans at one point, and then they become steam engine powered, and then they make engines, and then the Mitsubishi Zero Fighter is a product of Mitsubishi, and it goes on. Today there's Mitsubishi. We still see it. It's incredible that it's like such an old story.
Yeah.
And I could I'll explain what I mean by Zaibatsu. So Zaibatsu was a system in which the government wanted to control industry at the beginning of the Meiji Restoration, kind of like a fascist state, mind you. But they quickly saw that in the world of capitalism, it didn't work so well. So they said, okay, we're going to run industry alongside private entrepreneurs, and together we'll make corporations, and we'll, there's regulation in there from the government, but they really wanted the capitalists to do what they had to do in the free market. And that was the Zaibatsu system. And a corporation, like I mentioned, was Mitsubishi, was a big one that came about, but there was tons of others. And it really flourished when Japan opened its doors to capitalism. Honestly, like it was incredible. The steamships that came out of it, like the numbers, I think I do have a chart that shows the size of the Japanese merchant fleet. It's crazy. By 1913, it's enormous. Japan, obviously became a naval power. It had to. It was an island, but it's owed to capitalism, of course.
And it's
yeah.
Yeah, and you see, that's what I'm reading now. Is even though the mines were retaken by the Japanese military, sorry to go back to this, but even though they were retaken by the Japanese military after the strikes in 1907, they were still sort of capricious going into the years forward, leading up all the way to World Wars One and Two, where quite often the mines were actually worked by prisoners of war.
Yeah, of course.
So that's it means that the Japanese workers themselves were very, very negligent to get things done in there because of the obviously horrid working conditions.
Oh, completely forgot to mention, one of the main features of industrialization in the 19th century is railroad. So as you can see, in 1872, they put in some tracks. They started, railroad company, and it exploded. I think this is the quickest railroads were built. Like, look at, our history in Canada, of course, we're a huge country, and it took a long time to go from the east to west. But you look at this, 1872 to 1914, that amount of track, that's impressive for a country that just came out of a feudal state. It's pretty crazy.
Yeah, but I think back then that was their main source of long distance transport as far as going cross country went.
And trying to find a way to conclude most of this episode. You know what? The Meiji Restoration is a topic that I don't think a lot of people are going to want to watch because it is, quote unquote, more boring history. A lot of people don't like economic history, and I would argue the Meiji Restoration it's like 60% economics. This is the big cultural shift, and we're not even talking about like the religious shift. They're going into Shinto again in Japan. The differences in education, the art changed dramatically during this period. There's so much to say. It's like it's the Renaissance of Asia. It's enormous.
Yeah.
But as far as my channel's concerned, I can disclose information as to where this is all going to be going now, because I think things are going to get quicker on this channel. The channel is supposed to be about 1937 to 1945, and I say that in the opening of every episode, which I'm not getting as much flack for as I thought. I thought people would actually get really annoyed at that. But I felt I needed to do episodes on the most important events that created, the monsters that we see during the Second Sino-Japanese War. We'll call it World War II. And it's important, China is just dramatic. Like the changes of 19th century Qing Dynasty China to the revolution in World War I that we're going to see to this fight between Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong over communism and nationalism. Like, it's incredible. And then on the other side, Japan becomes it's just a military state controlled by the military. They have a gun to the emperor's head, though the emperor had his part to play too. And then the other players will be mentioned. I'm going to talk about Korea, the Philippines particularly. I have a lot of Filipinos watching this channel, and I acknowledge that. I'm going to probably do a standalone episode soon on the history of 19th century Philippines all the way up to 45, really quick. But as for the major events coming up, we're going to have the First Sino-Japanese War, the Boxer Rebellion, the Russo-Japanese War, which is going to be very entertaining. I am looking forward to that. I hope I can find some great footage for it. The revolution of China, so the fall of the Qing Dynasty, and they finally become a republic, quasi-republic. It's more like a warlord state. And after World War I, that's when I'll do some standalone episodes on kind of the politics and how things are going, but we're going to quickly find ourselves in the 1930s, and that's when the shit hits the fan between China and Japan.
Yeah, well, it's definitely a lot of things leading up to that. And for sure, we're not going to cover it all. That's why I think we went out of our way to say in the last episode that if anybody has a particular event or time period they want us to look into more, or an episode they'd be interesting to see, something they want to get elaborated on more, feel free to leave a like or leave a comment somewhere. And we can always try and delve into something in more detail. And as it is, we're just more or less doing surface research for most of these topics until we get to the real meat of the Pacific War, which is Craig's specialty.
Yeah, I said it to I won't say the guy's name because I'm doing a podcast with him soon, and I don't know if he wants his name up. But I was trying to explain to him, I am absolutely not a scholar on Chinese history. I knew as much as you needed to know for Japanese history because I took a lot of specialized Japanese history classes. You know, just the history of Japan in general, Edo, and then I took very specialized classes in the Pacific War. That's what I know the most of. And anything outside of that 1931 to 1945 range, more vague, you know? Mind you, my 19th century Japan's very good. But I had to learn myself all the stuff about China. And people call me out on anything I get wrong because I'm doing this extremely quick. Like I read for 19th century China, for my Opium Wars and my Taiping, I read only 5-6 books, which is disgraceful. Usually, you know, you'd read like 10 to 20. But yeah, it's an experience for me as well, looking at all this. And initially, before I started to make my content, I just read a ton. I read about 20 books on just Hirohito, 1930s Japan, obviously the war itself, certain political people in Japan and their lives, and then I realized, God, I really want the background information, so I went further back. 19th century Japan, you know, I looked, I should explain the Meiji Restoration. I should explain, you know, the isolation period. I won't go past Edo, but I should explain a little bit of this. And then I realized, oh man, but the other side of the coin is I need China. So I said, okay, I'm going to read the biography of Chiang Kai-shek. I did Mao Zedong. I'm like, you know what? I really need to talk about revolutionary China. And then you see the beginning of my channel is the Opium Wars that go all the way to 1830s. It's a rabbit hole. But we're getting there. We're going to get there soon. And I know a lot of people who subscribe to my channel, it's only because of the Midway episode that I did when this channel wasn't even called the Pacific War. We're going to come back to that. I got a lot of people talking to me about that. Former vet, actually, U.S. Marine, was saying he wanted me to speak a lot about some aviation stuff. And I'm not an expert in particularly American aviation during World War II, as people will, remark about my Doolittle raid blunder where I said B-52s instead of B-25s left some aircraft carriers. I'll never let that down. I'm dyslexic. And there'll be a lot of standalone episodes coming soon.
Yeah, but we can see, depending on the comments you got, since it's a very popular episode, when we get around that time period of the Midway episode, we could probably make another side episode and either delve into some of the issues people wanted to talk about more, or correct a few things, or, just kind of touch it up a little bit, and that'll kind of center us into exactly where we're going for this. So,
yeah, certainly. And actually, at the same time doing this podcast, I'm just looking at an email from, because the person who had contacted me, I gotta move my camera. This looks weird for the audience because they can't see this. I am proposing to him the next episode we might talk about the first Sino-Japanese War. So I haven't covered it yet on the actual channel, but it's going to be interesting. This individual, he is Chinese, and he's also going to be teaching characters. So the explanation on how the kanji works and everything, which is going to be very cool because I am definitely not an expert on that. Very limited experience, and the experience I have is only Japanese. It's certainly not in Mandarin or Cantonese. So it's gonna be interesting coming up, the new stuff. And our other friend Eric, that Justin happens to know, he'll be back. He wants to talk about probably the Battle of Leyte Gulf or Guadalcanal. I don't know. He was between both, and last time he was on was a tangent. He went on like a 25-minute rant about artillery on aircraft carriers for the Japanese during World War II, which was fascinating, and it's probably gonna happen again. But yeah. So I guess we can conclude with that. I'm sure we've touched about 5% of Meiji Restoration.
Yeah, well, again, if there's any particular area of it someone wants to talk about more or has any questions or comments, feel free to leave them for us. We can always do more research or, try and answer them individually depending on how it goes.
Yeah, if
So
you
we're also getting accustomed to our new setup, having to do this via distance right now, so it's a little harder for us. Please bear with us, and we'll try to get the setup a little more professional and rolling better in future videos.
It's really fun to go from my actual job, where I spend 50% of my time on Zoom meetings, to a Zoom call for this podcast, not using my grand studio, which is a laundry room. No one seems to have ever made a remark that my laundry machines are like what's being covered to the right.
I wasn't going to say anything, but I guess the cat's out of the bag now.
Well, interestingly enough, I'll just say this before we leave. I had 2 comments about my studio, and the only things that they remarked about was the map on the back of my wall it's glossed, so the light rebounds right off it, and it's actually really annoying. I never thought about it, so I need to do something about the lighting. But everything else seemed to be cool, and some guy liked the swords. Like no one mentions the fact that I have a real authentic Chinese sword from World War One. Like I don't just put that on the table like Anyways,
it's not like they can inspect it and authenticate it.
They'll find out it's a fake
on a YouTube channel, Craig.
I suspect it's a fake.
Yeah, if anybody wants to donate to the channel so we can have the sword brought into Pawn Stars and authenticated, feel free to do that.
I can use $5.
We're going to set up a GoFundMe so Chumley can come and authenticate Craig's sword.
Nice.
This is going to be the next project for the Pacific War channel.
And to conclude, my God, because I'm so far ahead of what the episodes are going to look like. The next episode people will see is going to be the Boshin War. And get ready for a lot of cinema use, because I like to use movies, and I found 2 great movies to take footage from for this one. Japanese made.
Yep. Excellent. Can't wait to see it.
Thank you, Justin, for being the economics expert.
I don't know about expert, but we'll say I had a few things to say, but glad to be here as always. Hopefully we can get into a few more things in the next episode.
All right, so I'm going to zoom in on my parrot. So this has been the Pacific War Channel, and if you don't like and subscribe, my little friend here she won't get fancy treats. She likes cashews, and they're quite expensive. So please hit that subscribe button, like, and leave a comment on how much you love and adore my bird. This has been the Pacific War Channel. Over and out.
Thanks, guys.